Hi, everyone, and welcome to today's Prevention Matters panel session. Prevention Matters is a monthly online panel hosted by the Canadian Observatory on Homelessness, where we dive into what it means to prevent homelessness in all of our communities. Most of us know that prevention is necessary if we want to solve the current housing crisis. But the series exists because if we want to address homelessness through prevention, then we must be clear on what prevention means. So, what can we do to reduce the chances that someone will experience homelessness in the first place? What can be done to support people who are at a high risk of homelessness or who have recently become homeless? And how can we ensure that people who have experienced homelessness and who are now housed don't face housing precarity again? To delve into these questions, Prevention Matters invites brilliant minds to tell us about how prevention looks in their work, along with the lessons that they've learned along the way. Today's conversation, which is the ninth in our series, is actually taking place just a little bit after our first birthday. So, the very first recording for this panel discussion took place on January 24th, 2024, with Steve's Prevention 101 webinar. So, if you're doing the math, that means our first anniversary was last Friday. Because of that, I wanted to take a moment to say thank you so much to all of you as our audience for your support so far, most especially those of you who've been here since the very first episode. Actually, if you have been here since the very first episode, it would be really cool if you said hi in the chat and pointed that out to everybody. It's been such an honor to be able to do this with all of you so far, and we look forward to bringing you even more powerful conversations in the year, so stay tuned. Today's panel, is brought to you in partnership with Away Home Canada and Making the Shift's Youth Homelessness Social Innovation Lab, and we're going to be focusing on Housing First for Youth, which is a youth-focused adaptation of the well-established Housing First program that's used to address homelessness for adults. Housing First is grounded in the idea that when we offer housing and support to people who are struggling, these supports should not be conditional. Youth should not be denied housing on the basis of whether they're ready for it, because housing is a human right. And if that statement makes you feel uncomfortable, then I'm going to encourage you to not click away just yet and walk with us a bit. If you're truly interested in improving the lives of youth, it's important to understand that Housing First for Youth challenges all of us to think differently about what it takes to really set youth up for success in the long term. And so while we recognize that this approach is a bold approach to take, we're pushing for it because as a research institution, we know that it works. In fact, our own data is telling us so. Today's conversation will unpack new research evidence demonstrating that young people are more successful in moving forward with their lives if they're first housed. Our panelists have some very inspiring things to share with you about this point, and I'll be handing over to them in just a bit. But before we get into it, I wanted to take a moment to let you all know that if you're interested in research and evidence-based solutions to youth homelessness, the COH, Away Home Canada, and Making the Shift will actually be hosting a conference next month. From February 24th to 26th in downtown Toronto, the International Conference on the Prevention of Youth Homelessness is going to bring together researchers, service providers, lived experts, advocates, and thought leaders from all over the world to showcase evidence-based solutions to youth homelessness. I'll be back at the end to tell you more about it, but in the meantime, my wonderful colleague Steph is going to drop a link in the chat where you can learn more about what we have in store. Focusing back on today's panel, though. Those of you who've been with us for a couple of sessions now will know that these panel sessions are not your typical webinar. Your participation is a key part of this experience, and so I strongly encourage you to engage among yourselves in the chat and ask any and all questions you might have during our open Q&A in the second half. I also wanted to remind you that your feedback is very important to us, and so if you have any thoughts on how we could improve your experience, or if you just want to let us know to keep doing more of what we're already doing, please do make use of our feedback form in the chat because we do want to hear from you. This session will be recorded and shared publicly on our YouTube channel. So if you'd like to maintain your privacy, I'll invite you now to turn off your video and rename yourself using the tools at the bottom of the screen. Since we're gathering online today, a single land acknowledgement doesn't capture the richness of our many locations. The Canadian Observatory on Homelessness is based in York University, Toronto, so we will share their land acknowledgement. But as always, we invite all of our guests to consider their position regarding the land in which they find themselves. We acknowledge our presence on the traditional territory of many Indigenous nations. The area known as Toronto has been caretaken by the Anishinaabeg Nation, the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, and the Huron-Wendat. It is now home to many First Nation, Inuit, and Métis communities. We acknowledge the current treaty holders, the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation. This territory is subject of the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Belt Covenant, an agreement to peaceably share and care for the Great Lakes region. So that's all from me for now. I'll be back at the end to tell us all a little more about the conference and other exciting things we have in store. But in the meantime, I'm going to be handing over to Steve, who is the president and CEO of the Canadian Observatory on Homelessness. And he's going to kick us off with some context before we get into the fun part. So take it away, Steve, and feel free to introduce yourself.
Great. Yeah. Well, thank you. It's great to see everyone. Thanks for mentioning um, the conference that's coming up. This is a very exciting event that's kind of the culmination of about 6 years of work of making the shift, which both Away Home Canada and the Observatory co-lead. And so what we're talking about today is actually a body of work that came under the umbrella of making the shift. And so I'm going to start with an overview of Housing First for youth. But we're going to then get into what's the evidence for it. There's been a lot of, resistance to prevention. People say, where's the evidence for it? And, which is ironic because most things that happen in the world of homelessness lack a research evidence base. So it's an additional burden for those on the prevention side. The conference we mentioned, if we tried it 5 years ago, wouldn't have 500 people registered as it does now, but maybe 5. So people have come a long way and people want to learn more. So let's talk about Housing First for Youth. Next slide. So we'll start with what is it? Housing First is probably one of the most evidence-based interventions for people experiencing homelessness, but why Housing First for Youth? Next. The idea came about because even the research from the At-Home Shuswap project showed that the outcomes for young people from a traditional Housing First program were not as positive as they could or should be. And the challenge was that's an intervention that was developed for adults. And we believe that, interventions to address youth homelessness should really be based on the needs of developing adolescents and young adults. Let's start with the idea that it's a young person, not a homeless youth, but it's a young person. And what does any young person need to thrive is a big consideration. So just over 10 years ago, so I promise you mentioned the 1 year anniversary. We have last year we had the 10th anniversary of Housing First for Youth. It was developed in Canada. The first Housing First for Youth program was in Calgary, I think starting in 2009. But we developed this program model working with service providers, young people with lived experience, the National Learning Community and Youth Homelessness, the Street Youth Planning Collaborative in Hamilton, and came up with something that we really felt was solid, was based on research and evidence and practice knowledge. So let's go to the next slide. The Housing First for Youth, you can read this. I won't bother reading it, but it's quite a radical innovation to put youth at the center of a Housing First program. So it borrows a lot of the key knowledge and principles from Housing First, but takes it in a new direction. And we'll see that when we look at what the actual program model involves. Next, guiding the work of Housing First for Youth are the core principles. And this is a piece of work that I think we're really proud of, that we worked through with young people, et cetera. This guides the work. If you are not doing these things, you're not doing Housing First for Youth. They're very much a rights-based approach. Every young person is ready for housing. Don't ever have anyone tell you otherwise. Everyone is ready. But things need to be client-driven. We need a positive youth and development and wellness orientation. So don't just focus on what's wrong, but also what are young people's strengths and what are their desires and their dreams, and work from there. And then finally, a social inclusion and community integration. And we've learned a lot about how to do that well. That was an area within the At-Home Shuswap research on Housing First that proved to be really difficult to do. And so we're going to see today, what do we know? So next. So there's two aspects to the models of support. The first is pathways to housing stabilization. In the mainstream housing first approach, scattered site housing is considered the housing option. But for young people, it really depends on how old they are, what they want, where are they developmentally. So a lot of the housing solutions for young people have to do with family. So how do we, if this is what the young person wants, how do we help them return home? How do we help address the underlying issues that meant they had to leave home? Can they stay with family, or not necessarily their parents or caregivers, but other families? What about chosen kin? It could be you sleeping at your friend's house and the parents, at one point say, you know what, you can stay here as long as you want, right? So it's a different approach to think about family. But there are other options. And by the way, all of those options are normative in Canada for where young people live. That's the primary place. Even people in their early 20s typically live with family. But there are other options, supportive housing for people with high needs, um, temporary housing, like transitional housing models, host homes, and then finally settled accommodation, which again, if we want to be normative, means young people are living with roommates, probably for the first time anyway. But it could be private rental, it could be social housing, it could be single or congregate. There's lots of different ways. There's no single approach to housing. And the key thing is that as we're talking about young people developing, they're allowed to change their mind. They might start out with, I want my own place, and then decide, actually, I think it would be great if I stayed with my grandma or something, or vice versa. So you have to be flexible. It all has to be driven by the young person who has a say in what the housing options are. Next slide. The range of supports is broader than for housing first. So, we help people get housing, we help people stay in their housing, but we also do things like focus on health and well-being, really important to this model. Because it is to any person important that they are healthy and they have strong well-being. But we also focus on like access to school, attachment to education, employment, these kinds of things. We do a lot of supports around life skills and these kinds of things. And then finally, social inclusion. How do you help young people find their own communities, get attached to their own culture, develop their own interests in the ways that they want? These are all things that every young person needs, right? And so we build the model of supports around this. And just so you know, these areas are the areas that are going to guide the research that we're going to talk about. Next slide, please. So what is the evidence? Let's go to the evidence. First off, next slide, a key question that is askable is like, next slide, does housing first for youth work? And that's what the research sets out to do. And in doing research on a new intervention, particularly one that you care about, there's always the risk that the research will say the outcomes aren't there, that it doesn't work, right? Like you can't assume that just because you design something that you really believe in, that it actually has the impact that you hope it will. So there is a risk there, a little nervousness. Let's go on to the next slide. In terms of evidence, so Housing First has been around for about 10 years, but there's a strong research evidence base that attests to its effectiveness. Next slide. There are several really good program evaluations that have been done. A lot of them have been done in Europe that show really strong outcomes. So that's a good starting place. But with our project, we're doing something new. Next slide. So this is part of the Making the Shift Youth Homelessness Social Innovation Lab. And so we followed young people experiencing homelessness and used what's called a randomized controlled trial as a method. Next slide. And what that means, first, before I talk about RCT, the programs we tested, we tested some adaptations of Housing First. So the first one was for currently homeless youth who had medium to high acuity. The second one was for an early intervention approach. So we helped young people who were leaving care, the child protection system. How could Housing First become a model of support for when people exit those systems and wind up homeless? And then finally, we supported the development of Ndayang, which was Indigenous-led and designed approach to Housing First for youth, including the research agenda there. So we were testing out different things. Next slide. So with Making the Shift project, we did a randomized control trial and we tracked people for 48 months. And so my expertise at math says that's 4 years. And so what happens in a randomized control trial is group one receives Housing First for youth intervention. A similar sized group is also tracked for 4 years, but we call treatment as usual. They may have housing-led supports, or not, but they aren't getting Housing First for Youth. So group one, the Housing First for Youth group. Group two, the treatment as usual. So what did we learn? I'm now going to turn it over to Salah. So here's some more details as well. Like we did both surveys and interviews with groups of young people over that 48 months. So Salah, I'm passing it on to you. Do you want to say?
Yeah, thanks, Steve. Hey, everyone. So I'm Salah. I work as a biostatistician at the CRH, and I'm also like part of the Making the Shift Social Innovation Lab. And I'll walk us through the results. Like Steve said, we followed these youths for 48 months, but then the results that I'm going to present today are part of like the interim results, which are just like looking at what happened at the first 24 months. And so please, next slide. So yeah, like you just said earlier on, so this is part of like the first 24 months results, and we are looking at the key outcomes that are like the primary outcomes, housing stability, and also as well as like health and well-being, and then we're looking at some sort of like social support measures as well. Next slide, please. Yes. So this is what the population of our study looks like, and a typical participant in this study is basically just about 90 to 20 years old. And it's fairly comparable in these two groups because, as mentioned earlier on, we're using like a randomized control trial and at a baseline, we're sort of like randomizing these individuals and then we're assigning them to these groups randomly. So basically the age differences is not that big between these two groups. Next slide, please. And yeah, the population is a very diverse population, I would say, and it's made of like majority of people are like, if you put the two groups together, are from like identified as white participants, but then like the Housing First for You group, we do have like a bit of a like more minority race groups as like Black participants as well, and we do have like indigenous participants and other members of the racialized community as well as part of the study. Okay, please. Next slide, please. And again, a typical participant for this study, it's a woman, and it's pretty much the same in both groups, but the Housing First for Youth groups and then the treatment as usual group. We do have like members from the gender diverse group as well, and then we do have like a fairly percentage of this participant identified as men as well. And another thing is like over 70% of these individuals in the Housing First for Youth group have like Canadian origin, and we do have like some people that are like originally international, perhaps like newcomers, and they're like Indian immigrants in general. And can you go to the next part? Oh, okay, yeah. So this study was conducted in two main cities in Canada here, Ottawa and Toronto. And the first participant in Ottawa was recruited in February 2018. And then the recruitment went on all the way to 2019 when we recruited the last participant in Ottawa. And then the data collection procedure began in early 2020, and then these participants were followed up for 48 months. And in Toronto, there was a bit of a hiccup, but then we were able to sort of recruit the first participant in September 2018, and then the recruitment went on all the way to 2020. And around this time, sort of collided with the the beginning of the pandemic. So one of the challenges that we face in this study is that data collection also sort of like continued in and around the pandemic. And then as a reason, initially, the study was sort of like designed to last for 24 months. And then went ahead and then sort of like continued for another like 24 months because of like the hiccup that we had. So, um, there is a workaround that we did to sort of like account for this pandemic effect as well. And we also did because there's a bit of a difference when these two cities start recruitment. So this is also accounted for in our modeling as well. Next slide, please. So this is the primary outcome, and when I would say the most important outcome, because ideally what we want to see is to like stable, like to house these youths like stably, and housing stability here is sort of like defined as the proportion of time a youth participant is stably housed within every window. And in a nutshell, that basically means like the number of days for every 6 months, the number of days that they spend in stable housing divided by the total number of days is about 184 days. And we look at this proportion, and we're sort of like interested in like how fast they attain high numbers, like they got stably housed, and then how long they can sort of like maintain this stable housing. And then we look at what the differences are between these two groups. Again, I will mention that we recruited like about 148 participants, and 50-50, fairly 50-50 in both groups, like 73, 75 participants, and the TAU had like 75 participants, perhaps 2 participants more. And it's pretty common because people that are not receiving the intervention, because this is not a blinded study, and people that are not receiving the intervention are most likely to sort of like drop out of the study. So we have a fairly 2 participants more in the treatment as usual group. Next part, please. Again, randomization, right? So at baseline, what we are seeing here is that the groups are fairly comparable, right? And if you look at the housing first for youth group, though, at baseline, they spend about 12% of their time stable house, right? And if you're considering like the 184 days before baseline. So we're looking at the past 6 months, how many days did they spend stably house? And on average, they spend about 12%. I mean, it's fairly comparable at baseline with the treatment I used for group, which had like about 2%, 2 participants more. But if you look at what's happening 6 months later, the housing first for youth group is attaining stable housing at a very fast pace. Basically like going all the way to over 40% stable housing. So on average, a youth participant that is part of the housing first for your group spend about 42% of their time stably housed. And we can see that this upward trend continued all the way to 12 months. And as you go, next slide, please. So if you look at what's happening at 24-month follow-up period, we're seeing that the average time spent by a youth participant in the housing first for youth group almost doubled, from what it was 6 months early, like 6 months in the follow-up period. So we got all the way to 84% on average time spent in stable housing. And the TAU, on the other hand, I mean, did have some sort of like rises. They rose from 13% at baseline all the way to 24. But as you can see, they only got to like 45% on average stable housing. If you look at the youth and the treatment as usual group. And one of the interesting thing here is that what took the housing first for you group 6 months to attain basically took the TAU group 24 months to attain. But not only that, the housing first for you group is getting to stable housing at a very fast pace, but they were able to maintain it. So there isn't any sort of like regression back to where it started from. And if you look at the TAU group, they have they actually had things like that because they have like about 43, almost 44% on average stable housing 12 months in the study, but then that went down 18 months later. But that's not the case in the housing first for you group. There is like a continuous, consistent upward trend from baseline all the way to 24 months later. Next slide, please. Thank you. And yeah, I mean, the idea is just not to get this youths like stably housed. We also care about what's happening to their like physical health and their mental health. So we looked at the health and well-being measures, which sort of like consist of like 4 subcategories, which is like the environmental health scores, the physical health scores, and then the psychological health scores. And one of the interesting thing here is like among all of those 4 scores, in both groups, participants got into this study with high physical health scores, but very low psychological health scores. And as you will see in the next slide. But in both groups, they had like in the housing first for you group, they have like a continuous upward trend with their peaks attained at 18 months, which also is very interesting because like this is during the pandemic, this around the same time that the COVID-19 pandemic started. But even though we can see that there is a continuous upward trend in the housing first for youth group, obviously like there is a sudden drop shortly afterward, and this again can be attributed to some of the lag effect of the pandemic. But in the TAU group, they did have some increment like 6 months later, but then there's a sudden drop during the pandemic, and then all the way to 24 months later. And the psychological measure, it's pretty interesting because also like it's among the measures that we also like run a very that's right before we ran like a statistical model, and we looked at if these two differences are statistically significant. And for the psychological health measure, what we observed was like the difference at baseline compared to the difference 24 months later was about over 0.5% more in the housing first for youth group compared to the TAU group, which was statistically significant as well. Next slide, please. Thank you. Yeah, so the brief symptom inventory, so sort of like it's a measure that consists of like 53 items, and then we sort of like assess like individual stress levels. And it does have like a GSI, which is the Global Severity Index, and sort of like it's an indicator of an individual stress level. And basically what it does is it combines information from the number of symptoms that participants, encountered, during the past 7 days before the study, before the interview. Let's say at baseline, we ask them like the past 7 days, what are the number of symptoms that you observe? And we sort of record this thing. And what we are seeing here is that the housing first for youth group showed like better results with lesser intensity of distress, like they have lower scores compared to the TAU group. And this, this improvement was sort of like observed, although, in 6 months time. So like around 6 months time, they had like about 0.2 percentage difference from when they started. And this, even during the pandemic, and around the pandemic, COVID-19 pandemic, it continues to go down all the way. And there's a bit of like bumps for the TAU group, they sort of like started to go down, but then there was a sudden shift to go up and then not over time. So the housing first for you group basically like had lesser anxiety, depression, and distress symptom compared to the treatment as usual group. Next slide, please. And also we looked at resilience, right? It basically means like how much, an individual, is able to sort of like bounce back from experiencing difficulties. And it's interesting because this cause, if you look at what's happening, the housing first for youth group in a way started, on average being more resilient compared to, the TAU group, it's more resilient at baseline compared to the housing first for youth group. But then like they pretty much like regress down, towards down. And then like in the housing first for youth group at baseline, they scored about 63 point, which is in the scale a moderate resilient measure, I would say. But then that's sort of like went all the way high if you look at what's happening 18 months later, which is interesting because it's in and around the COVID pandemic again, but they still sort of like able to attain high level of resilience. And what this measures is basically that it measures like how much of a self-discipline the participants have, like, and what their life means to them in general. And as you can see, the moment you get youth housed and the moment they're stably housed, they sort of like perceive their life in a very more meaningful manner compared to their counterparts as well. Next slide, please. So we do have like the crime screener, which is part of like the gains measure outcome, and it's sort of like assess like how the number of symptoms like a participant experienced in the past 3 months before the interview date, and a moderate to high score basically just shows a need for help when it comes to like interpersonal violence, drug-related crimes, property crimes, and they're like, and on average, the two groups, started pretty much, comparable. But as you can see, over time, the housing first for youth group is having like less number of symptoms on average compared to the treatment as usual group. And it got to the point that 18 months later, on average, the number of crimes or symptoms of these crimes reported were like half less compared to the treatment as usual group. on average. And they pretty much sort of like sustain this level because even 24 months later, uh, the score is almost half of what they started at baseline. So you can see that the housing first for you is doing like exceptionally well when it comes to like perhaps walking away from all of this like street related crimes, drug related crimes as well. Next slide, please. So get I'll talk a bit about this, and I think my colleague Ahmed is going to talk about what the social relationships look like. But so here, what we measure is like individual perception of their quality of social connections, and also their level of like personal relationships and social support as what they receive from like their family members, and how satisfied they are in general with their life as well. And essentially, like we assess like how fulfilled they are, or how fulfilled they feel in their like in their social interactions with other people in their life. And then other baseline, on average, both groups have fairly comparable points. But what you will realize is that like the housing first for you is like moving a very fast upward trend compared to the TAU group. And there's been like, if you look at what happened 12 months after randomization, the housing first for you gained like on average 10 points from compared to what they had at baseline. But and even within the pandemic, there is a bit of a drop, but then the drop in the housing first for you degree is still lesser compared to what's happening to the housing first for you. So you're seeing that even though the pandemic had some sort of like effect in both groups, its effect is lesser in youth that are stably housed compared to their counterparts as well. Next slide, please. And then like just pretty much comparable to social relationships, right? And what we look at in passive social support is like individuals' perceived level of social support from their family, friends, or just significant others in general. And then like this is from like a scale that has some sort of like sub level that looks like family, significant others as well. And on average, at baseline, youths sort of like have a very moderate level of like social support from their counterparts, or or their family members or friends in general. If you compare what's happening to the TAU group, they sort of like ascend to decelerate pretty much 6 months later. But by 24 months later, we're seeing that housing first for youth group participants reported to receive more social support from their families, friends, and significant others on average when compared to the TAU group. And they have like a difference of in points of almost like 10 points when you compare these points 24 months later. And I think I will just now hand it to my colleague, Ahmed. Oh, okay. There's still one more. Sorry. Okay. I mean, I perceive social support is just one of the stop. I mean, Ahmed, do you want to pick it up from here?
Hi, everyone. Thank you, Salah, for a
No worries.
detailed and thorough explanation of what we have been working on. Well, I'm Ahmed Monakhtar. I'm Senior Director of Research at the COH. If you want to know more, please Google me, time permitting. So, yeah, so we are focusing on perceived social support, but just let me take a step back and say, like, why is this important? Because it's an important measure that looks at how young people really perceive they have been supported by their families, significant others, and friends. And this is often something that is being used in clinical settings to evaluate the role of social support in mental health, coping mechanism, as well as overall well-being. So the higher the score, the greater young people feel like they receive support from their support network, which include family members, again, friends, and significant others. So yeah, as you can see, the Housing First for Youth group showed steady progress over time with some ups and downs, but an overall positive trajectory or trend by the end of the studies. In contrast, the TAU made improvement over time, but their progress declined kind of back to where they started. Next slide, please. Yes. Oh, okay. Yeah. Significant other. So as you can see, again, in comparison, you can see the Housing First uh, kind of moved from moderate support to high, whereas the TAU group moved from moderate to high support, but then regressed to moderate, especially These supports were important during the pandemic, where isolation, anxiety, and stress took a toll on mental health, and support from loved ones help reduce feelings of loneliness, anxiety, and depression. And many people really needed help with lots of small things such as groceries, childcare, even financial support due to job losses, for instance, or illnesses, right? So friends and family often stepped in to provide support. Next slide, please. Yeah, the same pattern you can actually observe in terms of perceived social support from family members. Again, this is pretty much close. However, with one major difference where you can see, especially towards the end of the pandemic, the Housing First group moved from moderate support to high as compared to TAU, which relatively remain in moderate support throughout. So yeah, I think I'm gonna stop here and hand it over to Heidi, who could provide just a little bit more about what these numbers really mean. And there's a larger story to it, like what we mean by social supports.
Thank you, Ahmed. And following Ahmed's lead, my name is Heidi Walter, and I'm a member of the Away Home Training and Technical Assistance team. But if you would like more information from me, please look me up or send me a message here and we can get back to you. I have had the pleasure and opportunity of working alongside the COH team for several years, and as much as my heart lies in practice and understanding how programs operate, I sure have a passion and respect for how important the research is. And one of the things that was really interesting, as Salah and Ahmed have really highlighted, is that this piece of research, not the entirety of it, but this piece of research really came about during COVID. And to see these numbers increase for young people was pretty dramatic. When we dug into it and when I spent time with the teams, understanding why were young people feeling like they had more social supports after being disconnected from family for so long, one of the things that they shared with us was that COVID was a common denominator. And it wasn't about why young people had to leave home, or it wasn't about all of the messy pieces that happened within their family, but it actually gave them a reason to be able to pick up the phone and talk about what was happening in the world. And they were able to they were able to bring back those connections. When we started to learn this specifically from the young people in one of the sites, this is where, and I think this is a significant point in our research and practice where it came together, where we started to see that the family and natural supports model and the philosophy was really important within Housing First for Youth. So we started to have lots of conversations with Steve around the fifth core principle, social inclusion and community integration, really means enhancing family and natural supports and community connection. And so what we started to really sift through, and God love those individuals, because that change was not easy for the team, especially coming from a place where they felt that they were housing workers, that they were a part of a Housing First for Youth team, and that was supposed to be their focus. They really had to dig in and go through a large change management process, a new way of thinking. The leader had to show up in a different type of way to lead the team, because as Steve pointed out, when we're talking about young people leaving care, essentially those young people have been brought into a system because their family might have been perceived as bad, or that they might have been perceived as people that they were not supposed to be talking to. And all of a sudden, we're now sitting here going, what if the entire family, every aunt, uncle, second cousin, isn't people that they shouldn't be talking to, and what does that look like? And so these teams started hosting family dinners after lots of training and lots of reflective practice. We started questioning, when organizations give out gifts at Christmas time for young people, do those gifts actually have to come from the organization, or can they come from those family members to bring them back together and closer together? And we really started to ask young people about what relationships they wanted, who they wanted, because it was in this moment that we realized that we are paid professionals. And while we are important as social workers and housing workers and researchers, we are all important, but we are not going to be with these young people until they're 80 years old. And so part of our job needs to be connecting them back to these social supports, connecting them to family, reconnecting them to new people, so on and so forth. Helping them create boundaries, to understand what healthy relationships should look like. All that being said, I really do believe the work that the staff put in, to and enhancing the Housing First for Youth model really shows why these numbers started to go up for young people. And it wasn't easy for young people and it wasn't easy for the staff. But I think to Ahmed's point, this is why we see the numbers that we do.
Thanks. Next slide. These are just some quotes from young people, reflecting on what changed during their time in the program. Okay. Cora, are you going to talk about this?
Yes, yeah, that'd be great. Hi, everyone. My name's Cora McDonald. I'm a research manager that, has been involved with the Housing First for Youth project since it began in, I guess, 2017, 2018. I'm going to build on all the fantastic quantitative data and findings shared earlier, as well as Heidi's reflections, just talk a bit about the qualitative arm of our study. So with the qualitative research component, we wanted to move beyond measuring outcomes to understanding the lived experiences of youth. And we did this through narrative interviews at two different points during the study. So in year one, we did narrative interviews focused on understanding young people's goals and challenges in both groups, Housing First and TAU. And then in year two, we wanted to explore key moments or critical moments that had influenced youth's progress and growth during the past 2 years or their time in the study. Together, these interviews aim to provide a deeper understanding of how youth experience the Housing First and treatment as usual interventions and the key factors that were shaping their paths. So a study based on the year one interviews, which I was fortunate to collaborate on, highlights the importance of early stages of adulthood as critical periods where young people envision their future and prepare for their future. So that's the slide you see here. This article was published and it's fantastic. So if you haven't read it, I highly recommend reading it. One of the key findings that we found through this exploration was a difference between Housing First and TAU participants and how they envisioned and prepared for the future. So for instance, with Housing First for Youth participants, we found that they're more likely to have clear goals and actionable plans, emphasizing long-term aspirations and also very importantly, the steps needed to achieve them. So they're dreaming, but also operationalizing these dreams. In contrast, we found with TAU youth that while they did have big goals, that these goals and aspirations lacked direction, and that they were more often focusing on survival needs, so the immediate versus the long-term future. And when they did discuss future, it was they often expressed uncertainty. Another important point that we took from the findings from this study was that Housing First for Youth emphasizes relationships and stability that creates an environment of support for young people. So this helps facilitate that planning and preparation. Whereas for the TAU youth, we found that without maybe this environment of support offered by Housing First for Youth, that they were prioritizing self-reliance. So they were often navigating challenges independently and lacking those really crucial supports offered by the program. Really quickly, I guess building on the understanding of how youth envision their futures. In the second year, we did interviews with young people that explored critical moments, so both high and low points that had shaped their trajectories over their time in the program. Right now, our team is analyzing this data, and I'm quite excited about it, and also to share some of the things that we've been seeing. So one critical piece that we've seen is that high and low points identified for young people were often seen as catalysts for change. So a couple examples to illustrate that would be one being securing stable housing was a frequently cited high point that young people mentioned in both groups. And when youth went on to describe why it was a high point, they noted that securing housing was a transformative moment for them. So it provided a foundation for much more than just like having a space to call their own. It provided a foundation for personal growth, taking on independence and responsibility, allowing them to pursue other opportunities such as education and employment, and also just a general improved well-being. On the other hand, for low points, which were often some examples include health crises or relationship breakdown, which young people cited. Young people reflected on these points as wake-up calls. So the young people shared that these moments pushed young people to reflect on their lives, make behavioral changes such as seeking support or addressing unhealthy patterns. Finally, what we're seeing in the data is the importance of strengthening connections. So as both high, like across the high, low, and turning points, young people spoke about repairing relationships with family, forming new bonds, or reconnecting with significant others as pivotal moments that motivated them towards stability and progress. So really shaped their paths across all the outcome areas. Right now, we're finalizing comparing a comparative analysis between the groups of these points. However, an emerging theme that we're seeing is that for the TA youth, we're seeing them report fewer turning points overall. So yes, they have these like turning points and transformative moments, but to a lesser extent than the Housing First group. Similarly, with the TAU group, when they're talking about high and low points, they're less often leading to transformation and change, and more often leading to stagnation. So like getting stuck in those moments and not necessarily moving forward. In contrast, when we look at the Housing First for Youth group, we are seeing young people express a greater ability to turn setbacks into opportunities. So when they talk about these low points or like wake up calls, like they're really utilizing them and noting them as turning points over the past 2 years. And also that they're highlighting just the importance of stable housing and supportive relationships as really the foundation for change across so many other areas of their life. So yeah, with that's just a little insights into the qualitative findings, both some of the published findings and preliminary findings from what's to come. Yeah, just to conclude, these findings just from the qual, I think, really build on the quantitative and the exciting things that we're seeing in terms of changes, and reinforce the importance of interventions like Housing First for Youth that address immediate needs, so getting young people housed quickly, and then providing them with stable environments and supports to kind of like transition into adulthood and take those next steps. So thank you.
Thank you, Cora, and thank you to the rest of the team. This was fantastic. I mentioned earlier that, when you develop something and then go to do research on it, there's a risk that the outcomes will not be there. So it's and then you have to face that. But what kind of struck me with the research here is in how many areas there seemed to be significant improvement in the lives of the young people who received Housing First for Youth. I have to be honest that it in many ways it surprised me. The degree to which after 24 months we've seen these improvements, and we're looking forward to the 48-month research, which we're doing data analysis right now. But we're going to have some questions here. First, we're going to ask the team I'm going to ask the team some questions, and then we'll move to the people who are participants in this webinar. And so I'm mindful of the time, so I'll ask a series of questions. people will often say, you know, Housing First and Housing First for Youth, will see it as a housing program. Now people are more often saying things like, well, it's actually a supports program that includes housing. What could you tell us about, if, and any one of you feel free to you drop in with some thoughts. What do you feel this research tells us about the overall impact beyond just housing stability? I mean, Corey, you mentioned these key moments, which that research is really interesting. The article right before that showed, you know, how people think about, not just how people think about the future, but their ability to actualize it is improved through participation. Anything stand out for you that you think is really interesting? And so
Yeah, for sure. I mean, well, first off, housing first works. So I think that like the key that like we're seeing even through the qualitative is that housing stability is you know, front and it's a foundation. It's a foundation for so much more. And so I think that like aligns with you know, research that we where we know that this intervention works. But for youth in particular, what it is has been just exciting and just I guess interesting is the watching trajectories change. So we all know that, you know, youth and being a young person, like there's a lot of change going on, and it's a massive developmental piece for like where your life's going to go. So I think in seeing young people first, yes, absolutely gets housed, but then seeing the opportunities that like once they're housed that they're able to latch on to, whether it's pursuing education, getting supports from case managers to go back to school. Like we saw that quite a bit, but also how to navigate setbacks. So I think that we'd be naive to think that like once people are housed, that like it's just this amazing, easy path forward. For certain, young people still experience challenges, but with the supports, and I think the key supports of the program, they're able to navigate those better, and I think come out stronger and like yeah, just with more hope for the future. So
I think Steve too, you know, some of the pieces that have already been touched on is I think as somebody who has been fortunate since 2009 to be working alongside the first Housing First for Youth program in Calgary, and here we are today, to highlight what Cora just said is it actually like it does work. And so I think there's just a period at the end of that sentence now. We don't have to question whether or not it works. It's been a lot of years, and it works. I think also too, I have the privilege of spending a lot of time with young people, their families, and their natural supports, and they're telling us that it works. And so I would never want to not highlight their voices to say that it doesn't work. I think that one of the things that I've really held on to two pieces as somebody who managed Housing First for Youth programs and now supports Housing First for Youth programs is that self-reliance piece that Cora talked about. If I could go back, I wish I would have led teams to dig in much more earlier on, because one of the things that I have taken with me sitting with those young people when Cora and I were sitting with them one day, and they said, if you would have done these things earlier on, it wouldn't have been so hard for me later on. And so I think what we're doing now within our trainings, within our fidelity reviews, within all of our coaching that we do, it's making sure that those young people's voices are heard. So further young people don't have to build their self-reliance so much and have much more time that goes by. And the last point that I wanted to make is I think sometimes we talk about wraparound services and supports, and those are really important. And that person-centered planning, and you know, one shoe doesn't fit for every kind of thing for young people. I think also too, one of the things that I took away was all young people might not focus on their health and wellness, or their healing journey in the 4 years or the 5 years that we see them within a Housing First for Youth program. That might happen when they're 30. That journey might start for them when they're 40. And we just need to be able to create the foundation for them to be able to start thinking about what they want that to look like.
Great, thanks. Ahmed, Salah, anything that stands up for you?
Well, I think, just building off of what the colleagues said, I think, one of the findings actually of the Sheswa project was that, they did not really observe a lot of improvement in adults population based on like other outcomes beyond housing, right? And I think that's one of the reasons actually Housing First for Youth was designed with that idea in mind, that youth actually have the ability to contribute meaningfully to the community, stay in school, access to jobs and opportunities, stuff like that. And I think so if we wanted to have that framework in mind, I think, housing is kind of more than four walls and a roof. It's about, and borrowing Peter Somerville's words from Understanding Homelessness, it's not just about physiological, expression of having like warmth and comfort and safety, but also it's about emotionally fulfilling, like being able to kind of, again, contribute meaningfully to the community. Social integration is important, and of course it's also ontological and spiritual, having like rootedness in the world. And what Cora also mentioned, it's about having the ability to have like a sense of belonging, purpose, and hope, which is important because housing accessibility is a foundational cornerstone, like the central piece that helps with all of the other outcomes coming to fruition. Yeah, that would be my.
Yeah, thanks, Ahmed. Yeah, I mean, I think I'll speak to the data because I'm always looking at the data. And just this morning, I was looking at the data and working on the 48-month report, which hopefully we'll get to present in the coming in conference, right? And one of the things that sort of like stood out for me was over time, when you follow these individuals and these youth participants, the moment they get stably housed, they actually end up using like less government services. They have like, because when you talk about housing first for youth, I mean, one of the first things that people talk about is the dollars, right? Is the money coming from? And one of the things that we realize is like over time, the moment we house these youths, it's sort of like relieving the burden from like the institutions, like in the public institutions, because and I remember looking at one of the studies that the past couple of months, which said that for about every $1 or $2 spent in a youth, we are saving the government and everyone involved over $6 on average, right? And that's actually is very obvious in this data set. Just this morning when I looked at it, at baseline, we've seen these youths were again into institutions, like the government institutions, also like hospitals and stuff like that. But then 24 months later, the Housing First for Youth group on average pretty much didn't report any institutional use compared to what was the case at baseline. So I think what stood out for me is like housing them, it's good, it's great for the youths, it gives them the opportunity to start their life, but also it's even greater for the government and everyone involved because it's also saving your dollars. At the same time, it's saving, it's sort of like lessening the burden that these public institutions might be facing. But also like, if you get into other domains like criminal justice involvement, crimes that we looked at, like the outcomes about crime, what we realize is that like the moment you house these individuals, they're more or less likely to be involved with the criminal justice system. And then, because criminalizing homelessness and impoundment costs money, so housing them inside saves you dollars. So I mean, I think that stood out for me. It's like housing first for you doesn't only get these youths stably housed, it also saves us dollars from the public sector, which is pretty much important, I think.
Wonderful. Very interesting. I think two things that really stood out for me from the data is the improvement in mental health and well-being. And I didn't really expect that, especially in the context of the pandemic. With the At Home Sheswa project, the largest study of housing first ever done, they didn't see big improvements around mental health. for the people in the Housing First group. Now the client groups are different for the At Home Chiswa project than this one. But I think the improvements in mental health that young people are demonstrating highlight to me why we need to not wait so long to help people who experience homelessness, why we wait until they're homeless enough and sick enough to get housing first. We should be targeting youth. We know that 50% of all people currently homeless had their first experience before they were 25, so we need to do that. The other thing that stood out was the improvement in relationships with family. We decided to hardwire in the family and natural supports intervention into the work. And Heidi mentioned, that to move people along, that was a change management issue. But we were taking a chance by kind of melding two different intervention approaches. And I think that that's demonstrated a huge success. And so, yeah, that's amazing. We're going to move to questions from the audience in a second. But first, I want to just ask this question. So say somebody in the audience is thinking, I wish we could do this in my community. How would I go about doing that? Do we have any advice for people who are interested in exploring, could they do this where they live?
Is it too simple to say call us?
Oh,
I was like, because we have the data, we have the researchers, and we have the folks that can help you with program implementation, from every piece of paper into what partners you should have in the community, what systems work best, so on and so forth. So I that would be my suggestion, is let's have a conversation to find out what supports you already have in place, and what resources you have. We've seen a lot of communities, Steve, who have moved from offering transitional housing and taking what they have and moving into a housing first for youth approach instead of transitional housing or short-term housing or even shelters, and switching into housing first for youth. So I would believe anything is possible because we've already seen it happen across our country.
Great. And the training and technical assistance that Away Home Canada offers on Housing First for Youth is exceptional, and it's second to none. So contact us if you're interested. And now, in terms of the research, if people are like, what's happening next? What do we have coming up from the research? Corey, you mentioned some work you're doing. Ahmed, Sala, where can people find out what's coming next, and what would some of those things be?
Yeah, so I think like a good place to start is the prevention conference that's coming up, right? Because we're sort of like preparing to release the 48-month data report. I mean, I've seen it. Spoiler alert! It's fantastic, right? And I think the Housing First Aid Group continues to do well, even over 2 years later, like 4 years after the starting of the study. And also, like, we're working on peer review papers as well. We're looking at some additional outcomes, and there will be publications coming from the team as well. So, yeah, hopefully we get to see you in Toronto, and it can give you like an idea of what's happening like 48 months after randomization. And I think it's a great thing. And spoiler alert, things are going good. It still works, and even after 4 years, and not only, we're getting them stably housed at a very fast pace, they're able to maintain it. And I think from the data point, it's important because you don't want them to regress after being stably housed, and that's not the case. So yeah, Toronto and peer review papers coming up.
So thanks for raising that. That's going to be in the Youth Homelessness Prevention Conference. I'm
Yes.
going to that session. So
Yeah,
that's great.
that was it.
Ahmad, Cora, anything else?
Yeah, I think we're working on a range of knowledge mobilization products, peer-reviewed papers, public-facing reports, policy briefs, and as well as presentations coming up at the Youth Homelessness Prevention Conference, MTS conference in February. So stay tuned for more. Mhm.
Great. Okay. That's great. Yeah, there's going to be a whole lot, now that we have the data, it takes a long time to collect the data, and then it takes a long time to clean it up and make it ready for analysis, and we're getting there. Corey, did you want to talk about anything?
No, just I would echo that, Steve. Yeah, been a long process, but we're finally
Yeah, it's
uh,
exciting.
there. Yeah, it's exciting to be at this point, and I think Toronto will be a really good showcase of all our collective work for the folks on this panel. So see you all in Toronto.
So I said I have one more question, and that one I just asked isn't the question. This is one actually that maybe is more in Cora, your wheelhouse, and Heidi. One of the things in doing this work that when we started 6 or 7 years ago was we wanted to have a new way of working between researchers and service providers. We wanted an iterative relationship where the researchers learn from the service providers learn from the researchers. And that's not easy because the culture of research is very different from service provision, how people think about timing, collaborating, that kind of thing. And so having said that, I think you two have spoken about some of the positive changes that came about and actually led to some new areas of interest around aftercare. Do you want to comment on that, the relationship between research and practice? I put you on the spot.
You want to talk about our relationship, Cora, in front of 70 people?
Yeah.
Okay, so yeah, so somebody who spent 24 years of their career working in shelters and group homes and in housing programs and being on the front line, when I came over to Away Home, and we blogged about this. When I came over to Away Home, I really was pushing through and telling everybody how it was going to be. And it was very interesting and needed to take a step back to fast forward to understand how important the research was. And more than that, it was taking time to build relationships, kind of like Housing First for Youth and Family and Natural Supports, taking time to build relationships to understand each other's language and each other's world and how you can translate it. And so I think one of the things John Ecker, Ahmed, Cora, myself, we've spent years, literally years doing this where I just sent Ahmed an email yesterday saying, talk to me in layman's terms, Ahmed. I don't get it. And so Ahmed would break it down for me, and Cora did a lot of that, bless her heart. And then I would take what they were giving and presenting it to the programs to help them understand why this was important and what we needed to shift and why we needed to shift it. And so I think for me, it was slowing down, building relationships, realizing with the fund, like, somebody's talked about government funders here today. You can't do one without the other. Like, you absolutely cannot. Research has to be molded into practice, and practice has to be molded into research. And just taking the time to build those relationships and learning each other's language. Yeah.
Well said, Heidi. Yeah, I mean, on the other side, I was coming from the ivory tower. Like I was like up in the up high and removed, I think, from service work. Had done a lot of research, but truly, it's just such a incredible and like changed my way of doing was like working in Ottawa at YSB. Actually, like our research office was out of there, and then really early on with Heidi and the case managers, and like Heidi said, it was learning. It was all about learning language, which didn't happen overnight. Like I think that relationship piece was so crucial to understanding the language. But transforming how I approach research, my biggest takeaway too, like learning from Heidi, the young people and service service folks, was that they have the answers. Like anything that's worth studying is is on the ground and often coming from folks there, not like preceding it. So like um, going in and being really open-minded to see that, and where it take like where yeah, the work that's happening takes the research as well. That was like a really fruitful piece. And I think all research practice, you know, relationships should be like this, but with the caveat of building, you have to take time to build the relationship, as Heidi said. So yeah, thanks.
Sala, any comments?
Uh, no comments really. I think in the interest of time, so I guess.
Great. Well, thank you, all of you. I'm going to switch over to taking some questions from the audience, and in about 20 minutes, promise we'll take over the questions as well. So I'm checking. What is the question here is, what has been the Canadian and Ontario government's response to this study? What information is available, maybe even from other jurisdictions, about the cost of housing first? Unfortunately, with elections looming, money will be a huge talking point. What can be used to show the government that this is worth every penny? I think the government of Canada is most certainly interested in the results, because this is quite new. The outputs on what it is. They haven't seen everything yet. So we're preparing like a policy brief for them. But in conversations, we've certainly had, they've been receptive on it. I think when it all comes together with the data and the outcomes, it's going to be a compelling story to tell, not just to government and funders, but also to community organizations, community entities, and service providers from across the country. It's like, the debate is over pretty quickly here. It works, right? And these outcomes are like, outstanding and surprised me. So related to that, there was a question about other jurisdictions. There have been some good program evaluations done in Ireland and in Scotland and in the Netherlands, and we have some of those available on the Homeless Hub. I think Steph can answer. We were going to translate the one from the Netherlands, but their results are very consistent with what we found. So that's important. And then the cost of housing first for youth, that's a key question. And cost modeling has been done to some degree, but we need to move a little further on that. The key thing around cost modeling is it's usually done like this. It's like, what does it cost to receive this intervention for 12 months versus what does it cost to public systems if the person remains homeless for a year? And there's lots of good research on that in Canada. Eric Latimer published an article in 2017 on this. Check him out. It's excellent work. But I think one of the challenges that is a positive challenge, but it's going to take some more research, is like, what are the lifelong impacts of intervening early with young people, right? Because as I said, we know many currently homeless adults had their experience as youth, and they're chronically homeless today. We even know that amongst youth, the percentage who are chronically homeless from the point in time counts is like 58%. And so going beyond just a year by year comparison, the person gets housing first, how much does that cost? The person doesn't get it, how much does that cost? I think there'd be a chance to really look at, labor force participation changes over time, use of public systems over time. And my guess is that the numbers would be like shocking in terms of positive outcomes. So that kind of research is going to be easier to do down the road by linking administrative data, but we do need to have some good numbers. There are changes afoot. We'll have to check it out. There's elections, announced for Ontario. And so I think people in government, when they actually see our experiences, Away Home Canada and the Observatory, that people are receptive. They want to know what works and what to do. So let's see if there's another question here. Housing First works, which is great. However, do we have sufficient support services for youth? I live in Toronto and there are waiting lists for supports, not enough affordable housing. Those are very good points. Structural factors that go beyond the intervention are going to have an impact on the lives of people. We live in a time where there's a great shortage of deeply affordable housing, and rents are high for the housing that is there. So we have to address that. I think in terms of public systems, we need more mental health, more supports for young people and their mental health and well-being, as well as substance use. These things are underfunded and the support services aren't there. There's some interesting innovation that's happening in different places, but we have to have those things in place, and we have to stop thinking about addressing youth homelessness or adult homelessness as a problem that the homelessness sector has to fix. Other public systems contribute to the problems, or the underfunding of those systems contribute to the problems that can lead to homelessness. We also have structured problems within parts of government, child protection and people being transitioned from care into homelessness, or people leaving prison and wind up back in the homelessness sector when we know that the chance of reoffending goes up. People being discharged from hospitals into homelessness, and whatever they went into the hospital for usually gets worse. So to really make a long-term impact on homelessness, we need good interventions like Housing First for Youth. We need to take them to scale, which can be really challenging, but we need them broadly applied. But we also at the same time have to work on those larger structural factors, the history of colonialism and ongoing racism and its impact on Indigenous people. These are big problems that need everybody on board kind of approach. There's no silver bullet here. Okay. 320. Okay, this is one I'm going to toss to Ahmed and Salah, I think, and Cora. Do you have significance levels yet for the 24-month differences? Why do you think there were decreases from the 18 to 24 months in the Housing First for Youth group? Does that question make sense?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean,
I'm interested.
yeah, that's right. Thanks. Yeah. I mean, yeah. So to answer the question, yes, we do have like significant differences between these two groups, some of the outcomes. And I think housing stability being the primary outcome is one of them, and also some of the subcategories of the health and well-being measures. One of the reasons why we've seen decreases after 18 months, one, it's due to loss to follow-up, but then we were able to sort of like bounce back and regain some of these participants in the 38th month or 24 months later. So because we extended the study, we were sort of like get hold of certain participants over time. But one of the factors is like we ran into like a low sample size issue. But also like the study was designed to finish in like 24 months. And oftentimes it's really difficult to get participants around the end of the study itself. And that's one of the reasons why we've seen like a sudden drop. But you can't take away the effect of the pandemic here too, because you do believe that the pandemic plays a role, and it can sort of like be the reason why we've seen that sudden drop. But and I think what's important is that yeah, there seems to be some drops in some of these outcomes, but never to the point of where they started at baseline, which is very important to me because I think we're pretty much worried if people have to like regress back to where they started. So yeah, pandemic effect perhaps, but also like low sample size towards the end of the study. It's also a factor to this. But yeah, in Toronto, we're hopefully going to present like the statistical model outputs, and we'll present like some of these outcomes that we've done like statistical tests. I don't know if you want to say anything about that, Ahmed.
Well, thank you. I guess I just echo what you've just said. And we don't honestly expect to see like improvement in every single outcome, and as with like any other research studies. But I think it's important to say that like Housing First for Youth has shown its efficacy in terms of rapid, housing of young people experiencing homelessness, especially in the first year or two, compared to treatment as usual. Once they are stably housed, I think that, trajectory flattens out over time. And I think it's important to understand that these nuances. Yeah.
Okay, I'm going to ask one more question. The young people in Housing First programs, question you often get, because like a non-negotiable is that people should be in the program as long as they need it, right? Just like that's how I worked with my children. So why would we think differently for young people? But and what we understand is usually it's about 2.5 years, and then people want to move on. Heidi and Corey, you did some work on what would aftercare supports look like. In other words, when people leave a Housing First for Youth program, what kind of needs do they express, and what are they looking for in terms of support?
So yeah, I think first of all, there wouldn't aftercare would be so extremely light touched if we were doing the right supports at the depth that they need to be within Housing First for Youth. I think that what I would see is touch points because in aftercare where young people might or family members or natural supports or chosen family, they might need somebody to call for system navigation, or they might have a setback where they might need a certain type of support, or they might need a thinking partner. And so I don't see it as heavy lifting as far as case management goes, but just somebody that they could call and just say, hey, do you know where you can get this? If they're just in the process of building their social connections and learning about their community and understanding what is where and who is who, I think it would be that. And I also think the social connection. A lot of young people wanted to stay connected with people that they knew about in the programs or that they had Christmas dinners with or Thanksgiving dinners with. And so I think it's that. But I would just say I think it's important to follow young people, especially because we did something really cool that probably a lot of people don't know is that um, we finally talked to young people after they left a Housing First for Youth program, which has never been done. Like, what happened? Where are you now? And what does your life look like? And so that was a really big deal to understand what was next for them. So I think do a really good job in Housing First for Youth, and light touch can be offered afterwards.
Great, thanks. Corey, do you want to add anything or?
No, Heidi, yeah, what a perfect way to summarize like the aftercare. Social connection was big and surprising, I think, like for me anyway. I don't yeah, it just came up quite a bit. So I think that it's network, staying connected, yeah, and everything Heidi spoke to. Um, and I guess just a quick touch point on the decreasing. I think it's important to remember that progress isn't linear. Like so like neither is growth. So like with most of the young people, I think as comes out in their calls, and Heidi, and I'm sure you could speak to this too, it's like there's setbacks. So like when there's progress made, when they're doing great, like then something might not be the right school program. It might just a breakup. Who knows?
Yeah.
So
Like
you're
kind of
gonna
like how we all have setbacks as humans and
That's
our
right.
lives aren't linear. Like
totally.
the young
Yeah.
people, we shouldn't expect more than what we expect from ourselves. Like it's life.
Yep.
That's
Thank you.
it.
That's a great way to end, I think. I'm going to hand it over to Promise, who will have a few comments.
Thanks, Steve. Uh, just working on trying to get myself back on the main screen here. All right. Thanks so much, everyone. All right. So before I wrap us up, just want to double check that we don't have any other audience questions we wanted to get to. In the meantime, I do have like a final curveball that I sometimes like to throw at people at the end. I'd be really curious to know, like some of you have mentioned you've been involved in work related to Housing First for Youth, like since way back when. And some of you have joined more recently. Um, I'm curious about how getting involved with Housing First for Youth, because at the beginning of the session, right, we spoke about how it kind of challenges you to think differently about homelessness, about showing up for youth, about what that looks like, right? I'm curious about how being involved with Housing for Youth kind of has shifted your perception of youth homelessness or what it's taught you. Do you feel like it's kind of confirmed things you already knew, or are there kind of like new things or ways that might have made you change your opinion on things? Anybody can kind of jump in, whoever's feel free to speak.
Feels like a bit of a loaded question. That is a
That's
curveball. Um, I would say that my perception has changed dramatically. I would say that as somebody who took education formally to be a social worker, I left that school thinking that I was a really important professional that was going to change the world and was um, going to be really impactful for young people and save individuals. And I think um, as I sit here today, 2 decades later, I now realize that my job and my advocacy is still important, but I don't take away from young people and their power and their resiliency and their voice, and that it's not my place to change anybody, but it is my place to provide opportunities and to provide resources and to give them as many chances as that I've been given or even more to be able to succeed because they all have drive and they all have will. They just need security and stability in order to be able to do that just like us.
that's really important to keep in mind though, I think, because there is like and sometimes it's driven by like the sense of urgency, right? Where everybody is like, I like we want the solution and we want it now. It's been interesting to hear over and over again how the idea that like you have to be really patient keeps coming up, and
Mhm.
that even if you've literally gone to school for it and you like feel like you know all there is to know, you just have to go in with an open mind and with a lot of
Mhm.
grace, both for the young person and yourself. So
Mhm.
really cool. Thanks for
I
highlighting.
think one of the things, sorry, too, just before, one of the things that we've had a lot of conversations with Steve, who is a professor, Ahmed, who's a professor, all of the research team, is that this stuff isn't taught in schools. And that's a piece that we need to change as well. Like, we don't get taught patience. We get taught boundaries and not to hug, and we get taught all those things. But we don't get taught housing first for youth. We don't get taught why family is important. We don't get taught about social connections and the importance of stability. And so I think that that's something that we could look at as well.
Cool. Anybody else have anything to add to that?
Um, that's a great question, Promise. And to be honest, sometimes, researchers like us, think that they know the right answers. Sometimes they do not. But of course, sometimes they think that they know at least what the right question should be asked. Again, they might be wrong. And kind of retrospectively speaking, I think going back in time, I think, what we learned actually is that youth have to be involved in research, agenda setting, framing, as well as, design and implementation, later on. I think it's an important consideration because sometimes we are not asking the right questions, right? And I think this is one of the, things that I believe has changed over time. And I think, moving forward, I think this is an important lesson we've learned. And we're trying to kind of incorporate that kind of learning into our ongoing practice. Yeah.
That is an important thing to bring up. Yeah, I hear again that sentiment of like keeping an open mind and being prepared to be wrong a lot and adjust accordingly. So I appreciate you sharing that. Cora, Salah, anything to add? No worries if not.
But I was just gonna say, yeah, I think family and natural sports, like period. Like I think I had been in this prior to like starting here, worked in this in research, and was just I think blown away early on and talking to young people about relationships and the importance of that piece. I think I wrongly assumed that it was just like there's no chance for reconnection or like family, which of course is the case for some, but like lots, like that it was clear that family were important. So I think just really exciting seeing that the FNS program come up and become part of the narrative. Yeah, and prevention too, like that. Um, yeah, learning a lot about prevention and how to pathways to homelessness and where yeah, the key kind of moments and trajectories where we can intervene sooner.
Cool. No, that's important to keep in mind. And I know we've spoken a lot about it, but like it's important to emphasize over and over again, like the idea that you have to be able to support people to reconnect with community or find new community where it makes sense. And it just goes back to that idea that sometimes people think that it's like, okay, here's a house done. And it's like, that's not how that works. There's actually so much more that needs to go into it. What about you, Salah? Anything Housing First for Youth taught you before we wrap up?
Thanks, Promise. And I think it's pretty similar to what just Carter said. Like, I think one of the things that I realize is that sometimes youth in general, by trying to help them, you don't just help them get out of home, but then help them reconnect with those back home with the solution to their problems. And I think again, this sort of like amplifies the need for help, like FNS, family and natural support, because oftentimes just getting them housed it's never enough, but then also like helping them address their differences that they may have had with their family members is really important. And also like if you look at the data, that sort of like plays a key role because like over time, the more the relationship between these youths and their family members improve, the more other sub scales or sort of sub outcomes improve as well. Their mental health, their health and well-being, and all of those things. So I think I kind of feel like the importance of family and natural support plays a role, but then also prevention, right? And one of the things that the data told us is that, like, for every year we delay a youth being homeless, for every year we keep them out of the street, just delaying it is important. Like, if you can't completely make it, something that will never happen to them, just delay it. Because, like, for every year you delay it, saves a lot to them, to their family members, but also like to the government, to the institutions, and all of those resources they will end up using. And I think that's important. Prevention is it's key to housing first for you, and this is one of the things that I learned a lot when I just started working on this housing first for you program.
Yeah, that's really important. So I'm hearing like there is a lot of upfront investment and there's no need to minimize that, but we've ran the numbers and when you look at it closely, it actually does still have long-term benefits, both in like a humane sense, but also in a cost sense. So yeah,
Yeah.
that's really important to emphasize to people.
Yeah,
Thanks.
I mean, I think it also answers to one of the questions that someone sent in the chat, like, because governments and people in authority, they value dollars. And I think one of the ways you can get them adopt this, this model is that telling them, okay, you know what, putting dollars here saves you dollars in the future, right? And I think that's important. And I think also it's apparent in the data set. It's like the moment you invest in these youths, get them housed, they use less of your services in the future, and then sort of like lessens the burden and the amount of money you might have to spend in the future as well. So dollars in, dollars out, it's key, and I think that's important as well in this model.
Thanks so much for that.
Always, thanks.
All right, well, I'll go ahead and wrap us up. Thank you so much to our audience, especially those of you who are hanging in right until the end when we've extended the session significantly. I think it just goes to show how invested people really are in the learning opportunities that are offered here. And it's just really good to see people continuing to hang in there. So without further ado, I'm going to go ahead and close us out. Just give me a second to get my slide up. Doing tech on the spot is so fun. All right. So thanks so much, everyone, for joining our conversation today, especially those of you who've stayed right until the very end. If you would like to get in touch with any of the wonderful people that you've spoken to today, or just get in touch with any of the organizations that have been involved in today's conversation, if you have any questions at all about this conversation, or anything related to prevention more at large, please feel free to reach out via the email I've just put up on the screen, and we'll get you connected as we can accordingly. Before we conclude, I have a couple of announcements and then I'll send you all on your merry way. So the first thing I wanted to emphasize is that I wanted to remind you to please use our feedback form because we really do want to hear from you. The sessions and the way they operate, the questions we ask, and to an extent, the topics that are chosen do rely on your thoughts and insights on what you would like to see on the show. So, and we do check it regularly. So whether you just want to let us know to keep doing more of what we're doing, or you just want to send some support, or you genuinely do have topics or issues you want to see us highlighting more, please do make use of our feedback form because we want to hear from you. Steph is probably going to help me put it in the chat. So yeah, feel free to just take a look at that and, submit us a response or two on your way out of the room. The next thing I want to highlight is that, as I mentioned at the beginning, the International Conference on the Prevention of Youth Homelessness is less than 1 month away. And as you can see from the speakers alone who we've had joining us today, the lineup is going to be absolutely incredible. This conference is going to be brought to you in partnership with Away Home Canada and Making the Shift, and some truly inspiring things are in store. So don't miss out on this opportunity to learn from the best in the field. We'll be joined by people from all across the globe, and there is still time to register if you're interested in attending. So to learn more about the conference, please feel free to visit our website via the link that I'm about to put in the chat, or by Googling the International Conference on the Prevention of Youth Homelessness, and we should come up. I'm just going to go ahead and put the link in the chat. There we go. But yes, if you're watching this back on YouTube, feel free to just scan the QR code that's on the screen right now, or if you look up the International Conference on the Prevention of Youth Homelessness, we should pop up. The final thing that I wanted to let you know before I send you all on your way is that next month's episode will be commemorating Black History Month by taking a look at how Canada's history continues to impact housing realities for Black Canadians today. I am personally very excited about it and look forward to sharing more details with you about that in the coming weeks. So please keep an eye on your emails. Big things are in store, and stay tuned. That's all from me for now. Everybody, please join me in the chat and with your reaction emojis to say thank you to our panelists so much for everything they shared today and for all their inspiring insights, and reminding us that, in fact, investing in prevention is the way. From a humane sense, from a cost-based sense, it's just investing in housing first for youth is the way forward to really create that long-term change that we're looking for. And I think there's just a lot of really helpful information that was shared today about what that could look like and why it's so important. So thank you so much to our panelists. As I send you all on your way, I'd just like to wish you a wonderful morning, afternoon, or evening, wherever you're calling in from. And whether I see you at our incredible panel next month, or maybe a couple months down the line, because we will be having these throughout the year, I just look forward to seeing you at one of these really, really soon. So that's all for now. Thank you so much. Take good care, everyone. Bye-bye.